Alright, let's get this thing up on the road again. Alright, as much as I love Coldplay, let's get to Evolution, Option D, 1, The Origin of Life. The first installment in a set of podcasts about evolution. Okay, so let's go over some key concepts or vocab to excel in our class. We have the Miller-Urey experiment, which will be covered in a little bit of detail. Well, to be honest, it'll be a lot of detail, but you don't need to know all of it. Then we have panspermia and abiogenesis, two conflicting ideas on how we got here. Then protobionts, coacervates, and endosymbiotic theory to take us all the way up to the formation of bacteria. Alright, are you ready for this? Let's make life. Let's tune in to Radio Francis.
Okay, as we all should know, the first living things appeared billions of years ago. With that, there are so many scientific theories that explain how life began. But there's one theory which is probably the only reliable one that truly explains how life could have formed. An experiment by two men, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, further explains this theory. In 1950, scientific theories that truly explains how life could have formed. An experiment by two men, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, further explains this theory. In 1952, they carried out some experiments, which were called the Miller-Urey experiment. So, the Miller-Urey experiment was an experiment that stimulated hypothetical conditions thought at that time to be present on early Earth, and they tested for the chemical origins of life. Basically, the aim was to see if substances that were now made by living things could be formed in the conditions thought to have existed on the early Earth. In this apparatus used by Miller and Urey, they tried to test the theory that organic molecules could have been produced when very simple molecules came together. They tested this hypothesis in 1953. So, they constructed an apparatus which contained a water reservoir, sampling ports, a chamber for the input of electrical energy, and then finally, the apparatus contained a condenser to convert the water vapor back to a liquid. To start this process, Miller and Urey added water, hydrogen, methane, carbon dioxide, ammonia, and nitrogen into the water reservoir. This mixture was then heated to evaporate water, which produced water vapor. Furthermore, electric sparks were passed through the mixture of water vapor and the gases, which as a result stimulated lightning. This apparatus simulated the possible conditions of the early Earth. After a week, the contents in the apparatus were analyzed. When they finished analyzing the contents, they found 13 of 20 naturally occurring amino acids.
Now, in chemistry, we'd probably have to find the IUPAC names for all of these, but in biology, we're lucky. We don't have to do any of that. Yes. Okay, so, to recap on what Francis said, for the recipe of life, all you need is carbon, sulfur, and some other stuff, and you need time and energy. Let's move on to the timeline of the world, El Timelino del Mundo. So, in this timeline, you can see that, let me use my pen, the origin of life comes right after prebiotic chemistry. So, one of the necessities for spontaneous origin of life is the synthesis of simple organic molecules. And that is what Francis explained to us in the Miller-Urey experiment. The Miller-Urey experiment goes on to say that those simple organic molecules, the amino acids, go on to form proteins, polymers. And then you have self-replicating molecules like ribozymes and RNA. And then they're all packaged so that they're all conserved and stabilized. Uh, if we look right here, let me use cyan because that's a cool name. Right here, we see that RNA is a big chunk of the world, except it's only there, right there. So if you really look at it, RNA is more important than DNA, and not only because it has one extra oxygen. Yes, it does. Deoxyribose, ribose. Yeah. Well, RNA is important because it can store, transmit, and replicate genetic info. Did you really think DNA was the only one that could do it? Nope. RNA, because it's unstable, can actually modify more easily than DNA. And so what happens is the ribozymes, the RNA molecules that I talked about before, they are very much like enzymes because they can catalyze reactions, polymerize nucleotides, and break chemical bonds like peptides. Eventually, all of that would lead to an oxygen-rich atmosphere. Here you go. You need oxygen. So, let's try and figure out how we got here. There are two ideas. One is abiogenesis, which basically talks about us coming onto Earth and how the development of the Earth, namely through examples shown through the Miller-Urey experiment, happened. But one big problem with the Miller-Urey experiment was the fact that the excess water would hydrolyze the polymers. So, whatever amino acids that were formed would eventually get broken down in the long run. And considering the fact that 70% of the world is made of water, that idea isn't quite as feasible anymore. So scientists have come up with ideas that you have black smokers or hydrothermal vents to allow the superheated steam to escape the crust. And this happens in volcanoes and other such superheated areas where you can have nitrogen fixation. So abiogenesis states that life started on Earth, but other people think that life started on comets. If you look at bacteria, the archaeobacteria, that is, if you're part of the option E group, microbiology, you'd know exactly what I'm talking about. These comets are even more dangerous than the volcanoes. So, whatever was living in these comets, if there were any, would have had to adapt pretty significantly, huh? And so, what scientists have found out is that the cosmic radiation from these comets is actually a very likely provider of the energy that was necessary for the formation of complex organic molecules. Also, these comets had hydrocarbons, amino acids, and peptides. So maybe it's not as hypothetical. Maybe it could have happened. Panspermia is the hypothesis that life on Earth began from material from comets, through amino acids or even bacteria. Now that we have a rough idea of how we got here, the need for oxygen, and the importance of RNA, let's talk about how we can stabilize the reactions and make it more long standing and more lasting. These bacteria could have either come up through the protobionts or the endosymbiosis theories. Protobionts basically state that the origin of life came from small molecules called coacervates, which are droplets of polymeric molecules, which are kind of like the enzymes, the ribozymes that I was talking to you about, which can absorb and concentrate substrate molecules and release separate products. They can also do indirect reproduction in this manner. So you see that there's a replication aspect that is covered by protobionts. Also, protobionts can synthesize, as I mentioned, And so once you have a covering around these protobionts, then they can start metabolizing their environment and they can start feeding, which is an important part of life. Now, one of the big controversies is, did protobionts did replication come first or did metabolism come first? If you're interested, you can read a book by Adi Pross called "What Is Life? How Chemistry Became Biology." So, what is life? Alright, now endosymbiosis. If you remember last year, we had a story about yes, mitochondria, or as Karan would like to call him, mitochondria. Mitochondria and chloroplasts are different because they are double membraned. They have their own DNA, which is very similar to bacteria, and they also have 70S, which means that they have 70 subunits, unlike others which have 80 subunits. They use binary fission-like replication, and they have double membranes. So, is it possible that these chloroplasts and mitochondria were some long time ago their own bacteria that were engulfed by bigger ones? It's a theory. We don't have the tools to go back in time and confirm, but both of them seem to be adequate enough. So, to recap, we need oxygen because it helps us break down chemicals to carbon dioxide and oxidized sediments. You only get that once you can start photosynthesizing, because then you can have higher concentrations of oxygen for life. And also, oxygen protects us from the ozone, or actually from UV, because it adapts to make ozone. And this is important because you don't create more of those soupy molecules. Then we also talked about the endosymbiosis and protobionts. I won't go into much detail about that anymore. RNA, which is strange because it can replicate genetic info as well as store it, even though it's less stable. But this is evolution after all. Perhaps there's a way that Darwin foresaw how chemistry became biology. Well, that's it for now. Stay tuned for the next podcast. See you guys later.